Good morning, friends. The span of about 36 hours, two of the most fragile diplomatic tracks in the Middle East both came apart on camera at the same time. In Jerusalem, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stood up and said 6 words that ended weeks of American diplomatic momentum. Israel rejects the 15-point document. And in Tehran, a Revolutionary Guard commander who now sits atop Iran's most powerful security body read out a list of demands so sweeping that American officials privately called it a non-starter before the ink on the statement had even dried. 2 rejections, 2 capitals, 1 36-hour window. And almost nobody watching the news right now is holding both of these stories in their head at the same time, because they are being covered as 2 separate conflicts. They are not. They are the same collapse, viewed from 2 different windows. Let's start with what actually happened, because the sequence matters more than the headlines. At the end of July 2026, President Trump stood in front of cameras and announced what he called a historic breakthrough, a 15-point plan built through his so-called Board of Peace process that was supposed to secure the disarmament of Hamas and every other armed group inside Gaza and lock in the next phase of a ceasefire that has been holding unevenly since October. For about 10 days, this was treated as the framework that finally moves the region from a frozen war to something resembling peace. Then on Sunday, August 9th, Netanyahu stood in front of his own cameras and took that framework apart in real time. "I want to be precise here," he said. "Israel rejects the 15-point document." He said the Israeli military will not withdraw, not 1 meter, until Hamas is, in his words, genuinely disarmed. His finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, didn't wait long to make his position public either. He posted on social media thanking Netanyahu for, quote, responding to our demand and clarifying unequivocally, and separately declared that the Israeli military cannot retreat 1 millimeter in the Gaza Strip. Read that phrasing carefully, because it is not a negotiating position. It is a red line stated in the language of a man who is not planning to move it. Here is the part of Netanyahu's statement that will matter more than anything else in this story over the next 90 days. He didn't stop at Gaza. He said, "As long as I am prime minister, no Palestinian state will be established, not in Gaza and not in the West Bank." That is not a rejection of one plan. That is a rejection of the entire premise that Washington has spent nearly a year trying to build consensus around. And then he added a line aimed squarely at the White House itself. "Contrary to all those who preach to us, we do what must be done for Israel's security, and we can and will stand our ground, even against our best friends when necessary." Even against our best friends. Netanyahu said that about the United States, the country that has provided him political cover, military backing, and diplomatic protection through 2 wars in the last 12 months. And the White House response to being publicly told that Israel will stand its ground against its own closest ally? Silence. No immediate comment. Nothing. Now here's why this rejection landed at the worst possible moment for Trump's diplomacy, and it has nothing to do with Gaza directly. Netanyahu is facing an election at the end of October, and his coalition is currently trailing in the polls. Every political incentive in front of him right now points toward hardening his position, not softening it. Ronnie Shaked, a research fellow who studies Israeli politics closely, said something worth sitting with, that Netanyahu may actually consider it worthwhile to enter a new confrontation with President Trump. Not avoid one, enter one. Because a prime minister, trailing in the polls with an election 11 weeks away, does not win voters back by looking flexible toward Washington. He wins them back by looking like the man who will not bend, even to his own patron. That is the actual engine driving Sunday's statement, and it means the rejection is not a temporary negotiating tactic. It is a campaign strategy dressed up as a security policy. And there's a second layer underneath it that most coverage is skipping entirely. Netanyahu only reluctantly accepted the ceasefire with Iran back in April, after a war that killed 39 Israeli soldiers and 23 civilians, and wounded more than 7,793 people inside Israel from ballistic missile attacks since the February 28th strikes began. Trump has been the one pushing Netanyahu toward de-escalation with Iran at multiple points, even reportedly suggesting Netanyahu should receive a pardon on his corruption charges, so that, in Trump's own words, there is nothing troubling Bibi other than the war with Iran. That is how tightly linked Washington's handling of Netanyahu's legal situation has become with the war itself. So when Netanyahu turns around and publicly rejects Trump's signature Gaza initiative while separately vowing that Iran will never have nuclear weapons on his terms alone, he is telling Washington something specific. He is telling them that Israeli security decisions on Gaza and on Iran both are not going to be outsourced to an American framework, no matter how much political capital Trump has spent building it. And there's a second layer underneath it that most coverage is skipping entirely. Netanyahu only reluctantly accepted the ceasefire with Iran back in April, After a war that killed 39 Israeli soldiers and 23 civilians and wounded more than 7,693 people inside Israel from ballistic missile attacks since the February 28th strikes began. Trump has been the one pushing Netanyahu toward de-escalation with Iran at multiple points, even reportedly suggesting Netanyahu should receive a pardon on his corruption charges so that, in Trump's own words, there's nothing troubling Bibi other than the war with Iran. That is how tightly linked Washington's handling of Netanyahu's legal situation has become with the war itself. So when Netanyahu turns around and publicly rejects Trump's signature Gaza initiative, while separately vowing that Iran will never have nuclear weapons on his terms alone, he is telling Washington something specific. He is telling them that Israeli security decisions on Gaza and on Iran both are not going to be outsourced to an American framework, no matter how much political capital Trump has spent building it, and no matter how much personal goodwill Trump has extended toward Netanyahu on the legal front. It is, in effect, Netanyahu drawing a line between favors he will accept from Washington and decisions he will not let Washington make for him. Now, let's go to the other capital. Because while Netanyahu was rejecting Washington's Gaza framework, Iran's Supreme National Security Council was busy rejecting Washington's Hormuz framework. And the way they did it tells you exactly how much leverage Tehran believes it currently holds. On Saturday, Mohammad Bagher Zolgadar, the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council and a commander in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, read out a statement carried by Iran's state broadcaster, laying out the price of reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Zolgadar himself is worth pausing on for a second because his position is relatively new. He took over as Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council in late March 2026, stepping into a role that had been held by Ali Larijani until Larijani was assassinated in mid-March. That is the environment this list of demands is coming out of, a security apparatus that has itself been the direct target of assassination less than 5 months ago, now speaking through a career IRGC commander who was elevated specifically because of that vacancy. When a body that recently lost its own secretary to an assassination starts dictating terms to Washington, the tone is not going to be conciliatory, and it wasn't. And the list is not a modest one. The United States must never threaten Iran again. The war with Iran and its regional allies, including Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, must be permanently ended. Washington must lift its naval blockade. All sanctions on Iran must be lifted. All frozen Iranian assets must be unconditionally released. The U.S. military must withdraw from around Iran, and Iran must be paid full compensation for war damage sustained in the 2025 and 2026 conflicts. Sit with that list for a second, because this is not a negotiating opener designed to be workable. This is, according to multiple outlets covering the statement, a list that both American and regional officials view as functionally impossible to satisfy in the near term. It is the Iranian equivalent of Netanyahu saying no Palestinian state, ever, under any prime minister named Netanyahu. Zolgadar made the terms explicit. The strait, he said, will not open until the United States, quote, corrects its behavior. Not until a technical agreement is signed. Not until sanctions relief begins. Until America's behavior itself changes, which is a condition with no defined endpoint and no verification mechanism, because there is no version of American Middle East policy that satisfies a demand phrased that vaguely and that expansively at the same time. There's also a punitive clause buried inside the broader statement that deserves its own attention, because it reveals how far Iran intends to extend this leverage beyond the United States itself. According to the reported terms, other nations that have harmed Iran during the conflict would not be allowed to transit the strait at all until they, too, pay compensation. That is not a demand aimed at Washington anymore. That is a demand aimed at every government that participated in, supported, or was seen as complicit in the campaign against Iran since February. An expansive and undefined category that could, depending on how Tehran chooses to interpret it later, include Gulf states, European partners, or anyone else Iran decides belongs on that list. A demand with that kind of open-ended scope is not designed to be negotiated to completion. It is designed to give Iran permanent, revocable leverage over a waterway that carries roughly a quarter of the world's oil. And here's what makes the timing so combustible. While Zolgadar was reading out that list, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was telling reporters that talks with Oman over managing the strait were, in his words, approaching the final stages. But he cautioned, and this is his exact framing, that this is not a sign of the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Two Iranian officials, in the same 24-hour window, describing two completely different tracks. One where Oman-brokered technical talks are nearly done. One where the Supreme National Security Council is demanding conditions that make near-term reopening essentially impossible. That is not confusion. That is almost certainly two factions inside the Iranian government pulling in opposite directions at exactly the same moment the world is watching. and it mirrors precisely what happened with the ceasefire violations after the June Memorandum of Understanding, when the diplomatic track kept moving, while the hardline security track kept undercutting it in real time. This is a pattern by now, not an anomaly. Every time Iran's diplomatic corps signals progress, a parallel security or IRGC-aligned voice issues a statement that either walks it back or attaches conditions the diplomatic track was never designed to carry. And underneath both of those competing signals, something happened on the water that makes the vagueness of Iran's demand look a lot less like posturing and a lot more like ongoing operational reality. Early Saturday morning, a vessel owned by the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, ADNOC, one of the largest energy producers on the planet, was struck by a missile while transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The UAE Foreign Ministry called it a flagrant violation of a United Nations Security Council resolution protecting freedom of navigation and accused Tehran's Revolutionary Guard Corps of what it bluntly termed acts of piracy. No injuries were reported this time. But ADNOC's own disclosure is the number that should stop you. This was not an isolated incident. This was the 16th attack on an ADNOC vessel since the war began on February 28th. 16. 3 of them just this week alone. And across that campaign, 1 crew member has been killed and 20 others wounded. This is not an occasional flashpoint. This is a sustained, months-long pattern of strikes against commercial shipping that has simply continued underneath the headlines about ceasefires and negotiations. A slow accumulation of damage that rarely makes the lead story on its own, but that, tallied up across 5.5 months, represents one of the longest sustained campaigns against commercial maritime traffic anywhere in the world right now. The regional reaction was immediate, and for once, remarkably unified. Qatar's foreign ministry condemned the strike and rejected the use of the strait, in its words, as a tool of pressure, demanding that unjustified Iranian attacks cease immediately and calling for the waterway to be reopened without conditions. Saudi Arabia condemned the targeting of the tanker as well. The Gulf Cooperation Council's Secretary General, Jassim Mohammed al-Budaiwi, called it a dangerous and unacceptable escalation and called for international action to protect maritime navigation. When you get Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE condemning Iran in the same breath, in a region where these governments frequently calibrate their public statements very carefully to avoid provoking Tehran unnecessarily, that tells you the strikes on commercial shipping have crossed a threshold that even Iran's economic partners in the Gulf are no longer willing to stay quiet about. Qatar's position is especially notable given the mediating role Doha has played throughout this conflict, hosting portions of the Oman-adjacent shuttle diplomacy and maintaining channels with Tehran that most Gulf states have not. When Qatar starts using words like unjustified in reference to Iranian strikes, that is not a government reaching for dramatic language lightly. That is a mediator signaling that its patience with the party it has been trying to bring to the table is thinning in public, not just in private. Iran's own president, Masoud Pezeshkian, offered a justification that is worth hearing in his own words, because it reveals how Tehran is framing this entire campaign internally. He said the United States had, quote, breached the Strait of Hormuz clause in the Memorandum of Understanding, and we responded to them in turn. In other words, Iran's official position is that the missile strikes on commercial tankers are retaliatory, a response to an American violation of the ceasefire terms, rather than unprovoked escalation. Whether or not that framing holds up, it tells you that Tehran is treating Hormuz not as a waterway to be managed, but as a pressure valve to be opened and closed at will, entirely dependent on its own internal read of whether Washington is honoring its side of an agreement that, from the outside, looks far messier and far less binding than either side is publicly admitting. It also tells you something about the audience Pezeshkian is speaking to. A president explaining a missile strike on a foreign commercial vessel as a proportionate response to an American treaty violation is not talking to Washington. He's talking to a domestic Iranian audience that needs to hear its government framed as reactive rather than aggressive, defensive rather than expansionist, even while the missiles keep hitting tankers that have nothing to do with the underlying dispute between Washington and Tehran. Now here's the connective tissue between Jerusalem and Tehran that almost nobody is drawing out loud. Both rejections issued this weekend, Netanyahu's on Gaza and Zolkader's on Hormuz, share the exact same structural feature. Both are conditions attached to an underlying process that is not actually finished. Netanyahu didn't say Gaza is over. He said Israel won't withdraw until Hamas disarms, an outcome nobody has a credible timeline for. Iran didn't say the strait is closed forever. It said the strait won't open until America corrects its behavior, a standard with no agreed definition. In both cases, the public rejection is not the end of the negotiation. It's a mechanism for extending it indefinitely while assigning blame for the delay to the other side. That is not diplomatic collapse in the dramatic headline sense. It is something slower and, in some ways, more dangerous, Two processes that are technically still alive on paper, while both principal actors publicly commit to positions that make near-term resolution structurally impossible. And once you see that structural symmetry, you start noticing it everywhere else in how both governments are communicating this weekend. Neither Netanyahu nor Zolgadar said talks are over. Both of them said talks continue, on our terms only, which is functionally a different statement than either side is willing to say out loud. And this is playing out against a backdrop where the war's human and economic toll keeps climbing in the background, largely disconnected from the diplomatic theater. In Gaza, recovery operations at the Karam building concluded on Saturday after 19 dead bodies were pulled from the rubble, according to Gaza's Civil Defense Agency. A grim reminder that even during an active ceasefire period, the death toll from the war keeps rising through delayed recoveries alone. 19 bodies, recovered not from a fresh strike, but from a building that had already been destroyed months after the fact, which tells you something about how much of Gaza's rubble still has not been fully searched, even as the political conversation has moved on to disarmament frameworks and stabilization forces. Israel and Hamas continue to accuse each other of ceasefire violations on a near-daily basis, a rhythm that has become so routine it barely registers as news anymore, even though each accusation represents a real strike, a real casualty, or a real breach somewhere on the ground. Meanwhile, in the north, the IDF released video on the same day, August 9th, showing the destruction of an underground Hezbollah weapons storage shaft in southern Lebanon, a reminder that the Lebanese front, technically separate from both the Gaza track and the Iran track, is still an active military theater layered underneath everything else happening this weekend. Three fronts, technically distinct on paper, all producing military action within the same 72-hour window. Let's talk about oil, because this is the part of the story that reaches into ordinary households, whether or not anyone is following Middle East diplomacy closely. Before this conflict, the Strait of Hormuz carried roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade and about 20% of global liquefied natural gas. Brent crude futures, the international benchmark, gained more than 1% on Friday to close at $83.55 a barrel, while U.S. West Texas Intermediate advanced about 1% to settle at $78.18. Prices had actually fallen more than 7% over the prior week, on hopes that the Oman-brokered Hormuz arrangement was close to done. Think about what that 7% drop represented before Saturday. That was the market pricing in genuine optimism, real money betting that a workable interim shipping arrangement was about to be announced, and that the risk premium baked into crude since February was finally starting to unwind. Then Saturday happened, a missile strike on an ADNOC tanker, a list of demands from Iran's Security Council that reads like a maximalist rejection dressed up as a negotiating position, and a Gaza framework publicly torn up by the Israeli Prime Minister. All of that uncertainty gets priced back into crude within hours, and it is the clearest signal available that markets, unlike some cable news coverage, are not treating these two rejections as separate stories. They are treating them as a single combined risk event, and the price action over the following trading sessions will tell you far more about how seriously the world is taking this weekend than any diplomatic statement from either government will. There is a détente detail buried inside all of this that deserves more attention than it's getting, because it shows the Hormuz story is not purely a story of collapse. Iran and Oman, the two countries that geographically bracket the strait, are reportedly working to finalize a temporary arrangement that would allow ships to enter near Iran and exit near Oman, transiting without paying fees or tolls during an interim period, according to people familiar with the discussions. This arrangement is described as endorsed by Gulf Cooperation Council members and expected to be jointly announced by Iran, Oman, the United States, and the United Nations International Maritime Organization, though the terms could still change before anything is finalized. So even as Zolgadar was reading out a list designed to sound like a wall, a completely separate technical channel involving Oman was reportedly close to producing a workable interim fix for the waterway itself. That is, the contradiction sitting at the heart of Iran's current posture. The Supreme National Security Council is issuing maximalist political demands aimed at the United States directly, while a quieter, narrower, more technical channel focused purely on shipping logistics continues moving forward almost in parallel, largely insulated from the politics playing out in Tehran and Washington. If that Oman channel actually produces a signed arrangement in the coming days, it will do so despite Zolgadar's statement, not because of it. And watching whether that technical deal survives contact with the political rhetoric coming out of the Supreme National Security Council may be the single clearest test of how much real authority that council actually has over operational decisions right now. Zoom out for a second, because the wider regional picture on August 9th is not limited to Gaza and Hormuz. Yemen's Iranian-backed Houthi rebels struck a government-held port on the country's Red Sea coast this weekend, deepening fears of a slide back toward full-scale civil war inside Yemen itself. a conflict that has simmered for years but keeps threatening to reignite whenever regional tensions spike. Yemen's own internal war has largely stayed out of the headlines throughout 2026, precisely because so much regional attention has been consumed by Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran directly. But a strike on a government-held port is exactly the kind of escalation that could pull Yemen back into the center of the story if it continues, adding a fourth active front to a region that is already managing three others simultaneously. And in Turkey, something almost unnoticed happened in the same 48-hour window. Turkey's parliament approved a Kurdish peace bill, draft legislation defining the procedures for the disarmament and rehabilitation of some PKK members, contingent on Turkey's National Security Council confirming the group has disbanded and surrendered its weapons. That is not a footnote. It is a reminder that even as two of the region's central conflicts are hardening in real time, at least one long-running regional conflict track, involving Turkey and the PKK, is moving in the opposite direction, toward resolution rather than escalation. The region is not moving uniformly toward war. It is fragmenting into pieces that are each moving on their own separate clock, some toward peace, some toward collapse, almost entirely independent of each other, which is exactly why any single narrative that tries to describe the entire Middle East as either escalating or de-escalating right now is going to be wrong about at least half of what's actually happening on the ground. So where does that leave the two central threads of this story as of Sunday night, August 9th, 2026? On the Gaza track, Trump's 15-point framework, the one he described as a historic agreement just over a week ago, has been publicly rejected by the government it was designed to bind, with the Israeli Prime Minister explicitly stating he will confront Washington if necessary and ruling out Palestinian statehood for as long as he holds office. Hamas, for its part, has said through a senior official that it remains committed to the roadmap Trump laid out, but conditioned that commitment on Israel halting strikes in Gaza and pulling back to what's known as the Yellow Line, the boundary defined under the original October ceasefire agreement. So Hamas says yes conditionally. Israel says no unconditionally until disarmament happens first. That is not a framework moving toward implementation. That is two parties publicly restating incompatible preconditions to the same American plan on the same weekend, in full view of the cameras. And Washington's own White House has not yet said which of those two positions, if either, it intends to try to move. On the Hormuz track, Iran's Supreme National Security Council has issued conditions that regional and American officials view as effectively unmeetable in any realistic near-term window, even as a narrower Oman-brokered technical arrangement reportedly inches toward completion, and even as Iranian missiles continue striking commercial tankers in the Strait at a pace of 3 attacks in a single week against one company's fleet alone. 16 attacks on ADNOC vessels since February. 1 dead crew member, 20 wounded. A quarter of the world's oil trade running through a choke point where the government controlling one shore is simultaneously negotiating a reopening deal and firing missiles at the ships that deal is supposed to protect. Here's the question that neither Washington, nor Jerusalem, nor Tehran has answered this weekend. And it is the question that will define the next 90 days, more than any single headline coming out of either capital. When two governments each reject the American framework designed to stabilize their half of the conflict, while simultaneously leaving quieter technical channels open just enough to avoid full collapse. Is that a sign the frameworks are dying? Or a sign both governments have learned that public rejection followed by private continuation is now simply how diplomacy gets done in this region? Netanyahu is heading into an election where hardline positioning is a political asset, not a liability. Iran's Supreme National Security Council is speaking in a register calibrated for domestic and IRGC audiences as much as for Washington. Both rejections may be, at their core, messages aimed inward rather than outward, statements meant to shore up domestic political position rather than genuine closing arguments in an international negotiation. But markets do not know the difference between a rejection meant for domestic consumption and a rejection meant to end talks entirely, which is exactly why crude oil moved the moment the missile hit that tanker and the moment Netanyahu said the word rejects. Financial markets are, in a strange way, the most honest observer in this entire story right now, because they have no political incentive to interpret either statement charitably. They simply price the risk as it comes in, and right now, both statements are being priced as real. The next test comes fast. Watch whether the Oman-brokered Hormuz arrangement actually gets jointly announced despite Zolgadar's list. Because if Iran, Oman, the United States, and the International Maritime Organization manage to put out a joint statement within the next several days that will tell you the Supreme National Security Council's demands were theater aimed at a domestic audience, not a genuine veto over the technical process. Watch whether Hamas's conditional yes to Trump's plan survives contact with continued Israeli strikes. Because a ceasefire that both sides keep accusing each other of violating on a near-daily basis is not a stable foundation for the kind of disarmament and withdrawal sequence the 15-point plan was actually built around. And watch whether Washington, which has stayed almost entirely silent through both rejections this weekend, decides that silence is still the safer option once the next tanker gets hit or the next building in Gaza comes down. Because right now, on August 9th, 2026, both of the region's central diplomatic frameworks are technically still alive. Both of the governments that were supposed to implement them just told the world on the same weekend that they don't plan to. What happens between now and the next time either of those governments has to make a decision that can't be walked back with another carefully worded statement is where this story actually gets decided, and neither side has shown its hand on that yet.